There are healers on this planet with the power to soften the suffering of mankind, yet they have remained in the recesses of the world, abused, discarded, and labeled as trash. This is The Touch of a Mustang. I am your host, Shalise Clough, and I'm here to tell the story of wild horses, Mustangs, and the humans who are discovering and sharing their gifts while working to protect their well-being and preserve their spirit, so this divine power won't be lost. Join us on this quest with the wild Mustang. Gareth Mare is a South African horse trainer who owns and runs Heartfelt Horsemanship. Gareth studied zoology and conservation with a particular interest in animal behavior. After a personal trauma and an incredible interaction with a feral horse, Gareth permanently moved from the corporate world into working with horses and the humans who love them. In that time, a zebra foal was placed by its mother in his care. Gareth focuses on connection and relaxation in his horsemanship, as well as helping people engage in safe interactions with their horses and build relationships both horses and humans can enjoy and benefit from. Gareth, thank you so much for being here on the podcast and agreeing to come on and talk about horses with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I have to kind of start with an interesting story. I started this podcast and I got a lot of guests at the beginning, and then I kind of hit a dry spot. And so I was kind of stressing, like, who am I going to get on the podcast? And I was thinking about it as I went to bed, and I had a dream, and the name of your like Instagram account, I think is probably where I follow you, was like in my dream. And I remembered it when I woke up. It was so crazy.
Oh, wow.
So I don't know what it means, but I don't usually have like prophetic dreams like some people do, but I thought it was really interesting. And then when you agreed to do it, there's lots of people I reached out to and just never heard back, or they couldn't do it or whatever. I feel like we have a good conversation ahead of us.
Great stuff. Happy to be here.
So to start with, tell me a little bit about just your background with horses and how you got into training them and the work that you do with them.
I got into horses. I was around horses as a kid. There were horses on the farm all the time, and I loved horses. Thought my career would be with wildlife. I'm passionate about wildlife and animal behavior in general, not just specifically horses. When I finished school, I was paying my way through studies of zoology and conservation. And while working to pay it off, I ended up working in a company that offered to pay for my studies as long as I signed a 5-year contract. And so very quickly, I just became a corporate slave. And once you're earning a lot of money, it's hard to walk away. So I left.
Seems like that happens a lot of the time.
Yeah. So I left for 10 years, and I didn't end up working in wildlife or horses until I had something of a breakdown and ran away to the mountains and ended up working with feral horses in a South African town called Underberg, which just borders on the Lesotho border. And there's a lot of feral Basotho ponies in that area.
And so how did that end up taking you that direction? Do you want to share any more about that?
Yeah, well, I ended up working, funny enough, for one of the clients from when I was in corporate, offered me a job. He had a lodge where they did trail rides, wilderness trail rides into Lesotho, 3 days on horseback. So I ended up doing that for many years. And then training just kind of came along with it. The animal behavior side fascinated me. So I started looking to the animal behavior, fitting it to horses, but then natural animal behavior as opposed to what we look at from the domestication point of view. Whenever I ran out of education, I started looking for resources. So I found books, Brenneman, Ray Hunt, the forefathers of the horsemanship movement. And I learned whatever I could. In South Africa, a little bit isolated in terms of horsemanship. So I learned wherever I could, and I started developing horses. And it got to the point where I got something of a reputation of working with horses, even though I kind of felt I didn't know much. I was kind of fumbling my way through. But people say, hey, you kind of get results. Can you train my horse? And there was an Appaloosa breeder up there that said to me, well, can you train my horses for me and prepare them for a show? happy to prepare them for a show, but as a kid, I'd had some unpleasant experience of the showing world, the harder side of the showing world. And that's all I knew of it. So I'm like, I don't want anything to do with that, but I'll prepare your horses. And he eventually convinced me, bribed me, to show his horses for him at the Appaloosa Nationals in South Africa.
Oh, really? So you were the one showing them?
Yeah. Well, for a lot of the in-hand stuff, he was doing show jumping, and I've got a terrible fear of heights, and leaving the ground is not my idea of fun. So he rode the show jumping parts. Yeah. But I prepared for the in-hand and some of the Western classes. To my surprise, people were blown away about how well behaved and relaxed the horses were. And they asked me to do a clinic, and I said, no thanks. But over the year, the reason I said no thanks
you were a reluctant horse trainer for sure.
Yeah, it was one of the things that I knew I could get results with a horse, but I didn't know how to teach people how to do that. So that kind of set up my journey of like, well, how do I teach people this? Because it's clearly a skill people are struggling with. And the whole path I went down was helping horses initially. I didn't really want to deal with the people side. I am I'm an introvert by nature, and I've learned to kind of practice some extroversion. But I realized quite quickly that you can't help horses without helping their people. So I started looking into a lot of the things that cause the common problems. The common problems aren't because horses are just horses and they're spooky and unpredictable. The common problems are because we have expectations of horses from the human side and from 300 years of tradition that don't suit animals, any animal, but especially a prey animal's intrinsic natural behavior. So I did a lot of deep diving into the different disciplines, things that happen as a matter of rote, that people just do it because they've always done it, that actually cause issues. So I started diving deep into each of the different disciplines, understanding why it happened initially and how it separated. It's not necessarily something that's new. When you look at the classical trainers, we talk about horsemanship and people think it's something new. The horsemanship comes from the vaquero traditions. The vaquero traditions come from the Spanish riding school with the conquistadors. There was reason behind everything that used to happen. Sure, we know a little bit more about behavior, the central nervous system, neurochemistry, all these things now. But instinctively, the oldest classical style of training had an understanding behind why they do everything they did. Somewhere along the line, we went into like the instant coffee mentality of, well, we just do this because someone told me to do it. And then if you don't know why you're doing something, you don't know when to do it. Yeah. Yeah.
And so what are some things that made you take this different approach to let those traditions go and really look at what works instead?
So I really didn't have a lot of exposure to those traditions. I had my first riding lesson when I was 32 years old. I'd been riding a lot before that, but it was kind of the get on and figure it out as opposed to lessons. And I think it certainly gave me a different perspective from the outside, as opposed to doing what we've been told is the right thing. Especially when people start riding at between 4 and 8, that's your values establishment period. And you don't question people in position of authority. Coming back to it as an adult, I think it gave me a perspective of thinking, hey, well, that actually doesn't make sense to me. And then aligning it with wildlife behavior. So I was fascinated by zebra behavior, and there's not that big a difference between horse behavior and zebra behavior. And
really?
Yeah, so understanding that from being a flight animal, approaching them in an empathetic way. I think that gave me enough perspective to say, hang on, don't just do it for the sake of it. Always ask why.
Yeah. And so tell me a little bit more about your work with zebras and how you got involved with that.
So even before, when I was studying, I had to do practicals with zebra, and it was really just data keeping for people that were doing their PhD of records and doing studies with zebra. So I was fascinated by that. But my horses based at a game lodge in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The horses and zebra got along great, and I had a fantastic bond build up with myself and one of the pregnant zebra mare. And she foaled down probably 50 meters from my house. She used to meet me every morning for coffee. This is a completely wild zebra. But she obviously watched what we were doing with the horses, and she said, well, this is kind of interesting. She actually used to follow me to the round pen and watch sessions in the round pen. So she had her little zebra foal, and the zebra foal used to follow her around. But unfortunately, she passed away when the baby was 3 months old. The area that we were, I know everyone thinks of Africa as a scorching hot place, but the area we were was right up against the Drakensberg Mountains.
Yeah.
And we have snowy winters, surprisingly. And this little thing was 3 months old going into a snowy winter. So I had to get her tame in order to pull her through. So there was a lot of testing my horsemanship knowledge and having to adjust it. I think it definitely taught me how little pressure is needed. And since working with her and getting her tame, adjusted how much pressure I use with horses. And the change has been phenomenal. You know, with horses, people talk about oppositional reflex. After that experience, I would say there's no oppositional reflex in terms of there's not an immediate refusal instinct in a horse unless you push them to that point where they want to fight. And that has been very helpful for me working with troubled horses.
Yeah, that is really interesting because it does seem like you don't get those big reactions until other stuff has kind of happened along the way. So that makes sense that if you're noting that you maybe never hit that point where you guys are in opposition.
Yeah. You know, obviously like with feral horses, when you're handling and you're building up that initial bond, building that initial trust, the minute they feel trapped, then you hit that oppositional reflex. But you can build so much communication before you ever hit that point of conflict rather than conversation.
Yeah. And so do you think with the zebra's mother, it almost sounds like you kind of just became a part of her world rather than putting that pressure on her to enter your world?
Yeah, absolutely. I never ever thought for a million years it was bizarre that she started showing up. And, you know, there's that weird otherworldly question in the back of your head. Did she know she was going to die at 3 months when her baby was 3 months old and she was setting up something? It doesn't quite make sense in our human understanding, but zebra, if a foal is abandoned, they run as far from it as possible because it attracts predators. And that's exactly what happened. Her herd left this foal alone, and we didn't see that probably 2 months. That herd didn't come back around the houses because they know there's a heightened risk of predators being around. She, knowing this, is probably like, well, hang on a minute. This guy looks like he's looking after horses. Maybe he can look after the foal.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And so this was just a wild herd that she kind of came out of and started hanging out at your place. Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. Like I said, I used to sit on my...
It's fascinating. That's so neat.
Yeah. I would sit on my veranda, have a cup of coffee. If I was playing guitar, she was very fascinated that this is like the best thing in the world. So I used to do these little one soul concerts to this pregnant zebra sitting on the veranda with me.
Yeah, that's magical.
Yeah.
It is otherworldly.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about the time that you spent with feral horses. This is kind of after you left the corporate world.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. So, like I said, I was actually taking trails, but it is one of those roles that it's normally people passing through for a few years and they move on. But everyone that came through for that role was kind of expected to start some horses under saddle. And they had a feral herd up on the mountain. Every year you bring the feral herd in and choose between 5 and 10 horses to train. And I hadn't got to the stage of working with those horses. I was still doing so many back-to-back trails into Lesotho that I didn't have the time to be there. But I had some experiences with that feral herd. The first one was me being in a kind of a state of breakdown and walking up the mountain with a bottle of brandy, thinking I'm going to drown my sorrows, and sitting by a riverside and actually being approached by this herd of feral horses. And my heart beat quite fast having this massive herd come right up to. And one little mare of this feral herd came straight out of the herd and came up and sniffed me. And literally gave me the full inspection. And
wow.
I had a fantastic experience with that. It completely gave me the sense of healing, and it gave me a sense of acknowledgement. I felt seen by this animal. And the next morning, I was doing trails, but I woke up crack of dawn and went out and found the herd again. And I got gung-ho, and I thought, okay, I'm going to take a halter out, and I'm going to halter this wild horse. And she taught me a little bit about expectations that day, and she headed for the hills. But the begging forgiveness after that point taught me a lot about them. So she was the first horse that I trained from the point of being completely feral, bringing along, and then getting to the point of a riding horse. The fascinating thing from her was, I used to joke with people about it being the 1,000-hectare round pen, because this was out on a hillside. She could go wherever she wanted. That process of getting her to trust me took really long. Once I got that halter on and I was developing communication, everything made sense to her. It wasn't a battle, get her to understand. She's like, okay, cool, I trust you. This has got to be something interesting, not trying to harm me. It all came so easily. Of course, along the way after that, I had some tough lessons because I expected that out of other horses. But she certainly taught me that that relationship aspect makes everything else come much easier afterwards.
Yeah. And so what were some of the things that you did to earn her trust while she was, it sounds like, basically free to go if she wanted to?
There was a whole lot of doing nothing. And I felt that every single point of progress. So after that second day where I literally reached up and tried to put a halt on a feral horse, and she bolted, and she wouldn't come probably within 200 meters of me after that. I would just go up there and sit.
Yeah.
And just be on the outskirts, move with the herd and be on the outskirts. And eventually she started coming in again, and I was disciplined about not expecting anything. So I wouldn't take halters. I would just sit there. And eventually I started taking stuff along. And she got back to that point where she would, investigate me, give the muzzles. Still a scary thing when you think, so she wasn't a big horse. I think if she was 300 kgs, it was a lot. But still intimidating having a big flight animal with the possibility that it might turn and try and defend itself and kick my head off. I got to the point where I trusted her. And then I got to the point where I was starting to take up ropes, not actual halters, I would just take a rope up. And she got to the point where it felt like she was clearly saying, I am ready to look at this thing. And she would pick up the rope and play with it. Pick up the rope and play with it. And pick it up, put it on me. Pick it up, put it on me. And only when we got to that point did I start actually stroking her, reaching out, and she would lean in and her face would touch my hand. Got that progressive and went through the same process with the rope. But we're not talking days, we're talking probably between 6 weeks and 3 months. I don't know the exact time frame, but it was a long period of doing a lot of nothing.
A long time in the horse training.
Yeah. I mean, the other guys that were working on that ranch, they brought the horses in, they put them in the round pen. And, it was normally they would rope the horse, get it done. And there was a lot of dust and a lot of sweat.
Yeah.
No judgment, but I just didn't feel that approach resonated with me at all.
Was that, what did they think about you just going and sitting out on the mountain waiting for this horse?
I never told anyone. I never told anyone about that. In fact, I think the first time, the first time I've actually told anyone detail about the story was probably about a month or two ago where I just started writing little bits about it on Facebook. And I think that is probably the first time I've even spoken about it. Because at the time, yes, I would have being ridiculed would be an understatement. I don't even think my boss would have been happy about it, even though I was always doing it in my own free time. I think he would have thought I was mad.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's so interesting because so often we do change how we interact with animals because of how we think maybe other people think we should, or even, I
Yeah.
know for me, I would often be very quiet about the way I was working with my horse because it was not, it was a long process also. And so I almost felt embarrassed or whatever. But that's interesting how that can inform our behavior, just the pressure that we're
Yeah.
getting from outside forces. Did
Look, I
you
think
also feel that pressure? I mean,
absolutely. I felt I'd be ridiculed. At the same time, it wasn't something that I knew. I didn't know the answers. For me to go and tell someone else, I'm doing this and I think this is right, I needed that space to figure things out before telling anyone how I was doing things.
yeah, seems like an incredible learning process. And,
Yeah.
the fact that it took so long, I think, is almost a testament that a lot of times to do things properly in a way that does feel good to us, it can take a lot more time and really going off the beaten path that everybody else is
Yeah.
on.
I mean, from that point, I was encouraged to build my education, and in that, I learned a lot of stuff. There was a lot of value to what I learned, but there was also a lot of convention. And over the years, I probably brought things into the way I worked with horses that didn't fit. Maybe what I do now is, at least for the initial part, is a little closer to what I did back then. But I think when you start working on the education, sometimes we get taught how to take the shortcuts. And I'm a big fan of education. I definitely think everyone should educate themselves, but always leave space for the questioning. Hang on, could we do this under rather than foster?
Yeah, I do love that idea that, keep learning, but don't be afraid to question it. And especially if it's something that just doesn't sit quite right, because a lot of times ideas are given to us more as fact when they're not fact at all. They're just ideas, theories, someone else's approach.
Yeah. And everyone's got different priorities. There are so many different horsemanship programs or equestrian programs. It's not necessarily that they're bad programs, but those people might prioritize something different to you. Someone that is highly competitive, athletically minded. So they might not necessarily be as about the horse as you are. You might be there for the connection.
Yeah.
That person's got ambitions linked to athleticism. Not to say that you can't learn something from those people.
Right.
That's not necessarily going to be the path you need to take.
My mare that was my first Mustang, she, my purpose with her was really to kind of, let my kids have horses, a horse for me or whatever. So she's very well trained at taking care of her rider and stuff. But, a lot of people would say she's not trained at all because as far as okay, now we're going to go into a lope and we're going to check our leads and stuff. We haven't worked on anything with that. But that's exactly why, because that was not my priority. I really wanted her to just be available for my kids to have that experience and for me to kind of have that relationship with her.
I think that's a big thing, that priority thing. As horse trainers, imposter syndrome is a big thing. And when people started listening to me, I was like, I don't know why you're listening to me. And then people start asking you, why should we listen to you? And you think, well, actually, because I'm really good at this. But you normally, so you putting on a clinic or doing lessons in an area and you put out adverts, everyone wants to see a CV of your show record. And I did have a pretty successful, I do have a pretty successful show CV, but I will be the first to tell you, I am not a great rider. My position's not great, and I have 3 South African championships in various Western disciplines, and I promise you now that in those classes there were at least 4 riders better than me in every single one of those classes. I had an unfair advantage because I had a relaxed horse. Relaxation is my strength. No, teaching you lead changes is probably not going to be my strength, but I can get your horse relaxed.
Which is huge, I think, because that tension is what creates so many problems.
Yeah. The stuff comes naturally once. I have a hard time even when people ask me what I do and I don't have the time to sit and give a 20-minute monologue, I say I'm a horse trainer. But it seems like the most condescending thing to the horse to say, I train horses or I school horses. Everything we'll ever ask of them, they know how to do without us. What we're doing is we're developing a communication with them that they do it when we ask them. It's not training, it's not schooling, it's developing communication.
Yeah. And so was this little wild mare, was she the first horse that you trained?
When I was a kid, we had race horses on the property. They were really just there for spelling. Wasn't a farm's business. We just did subsistence type farming. So there was a thoroughbred colt that I trained when I was 11. But that was far from there was some horsemanship involved. There was a Zulu guy that worked on the property, and he taught me quite a lot about horses, but it really was a strap on and go type scenario. And I had my first major fall in that process. So she was technically the second.
I bet. But it was after her that you really entered the world of helping horses.
Yes, yeah. She was the one that got me a little more confident to work with other horses. And then when people started seeing the results, in fact, my boss was the one that used to recommend me to people to help with troubled horses. And the Appaloosa breeder that contacted me, that was by reputation after that little black mare.
And so what happened to her?
Like I said, once we got past the taming part, she was a really quick study. And we had her working stock probably from the point of my first ride, 2 months she was working stock. And then another month she was taking guests into Lesotho. When I moved on from there, she stayed there. So for all I know, she's still going strong. 14 years ago now. I don't even know how old she was when I started her. Those little Lesotho ponies in South Africa, they're very well known they live forever.
So where do you kind of go from there after your time with the feral horses and up in the mountains?
So I started developing a little bit of how to teach people what I do and getting a bit more concrete in what I do. Apprenticed with a trainer from Colorado. She came out to South Africa and apprenticed with her for 10 years. And within 3 or 4 years, I built a little bit of confidence in terms of giving my own clinics and helping troubled horses and training horses from the start, and also helping people with the Western discipline in South Africa. At that stage, Western disciplines were almost non-existent. So I didn't have a ton of knowledge on it. And like I said, I wouldn't call myself a good rider, but I did pretty well with a relaxed horse and knowing the rules. So I would teach people Western disciplines as well. So it was just after that little black Lesotho pony mare that I started heartfelt horsemanship. It was initially mainly training horses still, but through that process of working with troubled horses, I started to learn the common pitfalls that people had from tradition.
And so what are some of the things that you do differently in your horsemanship, or what are some of the things you learned that has made it effective so that you can more or less help the horses that are struggling the most?
Yeah, look, it's actually really simple. If you just consider it from the horse's point of view and understanding their natural behavior, things get a lot easier. Horses are a prey animal, we're a predator, and we come along and we strap the hides of dead animals to them and expect them to tolerate that, and then we climb on them like a lion would to eat them. I know that's a commonly recycled thing, but if you just take a step back and think about it from their perspective, if we can take away that fear before we start building any language, things go a lot easier. So even once you've got past that point of them thinking we're going to eat them, when you're building that communication, I try and mimic horse language in everything that I do. So horses don't really communicate much by pushing and pulling on each other. They normally use rhythmic pressure. So I use a lot of rhythm to get yields initially, and then I use those established yields to introduce, the push and pull that we need for when we actually get on and we're riding. So I think that's the biggest one, is considering how they feel and then introducing it in a language that makes sense to them.
Yeah. So when you kind of decided to leave the corporate world, you said it was not the greatest time in your life. What led you up into the mountains? And I guess, how did that change things for you?
So I went through a personal trauma. My 11-year-old daughter passed away, and it was such a period of flux. Don't even think it was a conscious state. It was just like overwhelmed. Life carries on even when these massive traumas occur, and you've got to do the bureaucracy, dealing with the health insurances, hospital bills. Nothing stops. And I just felt, well, I just need the world to stop so I can step off and actually feel something for a minute.
Yeah.
And that overwhelming emotion, it was almost automatic. I parked company car, left the keys in the office, packed a bag and a guitar, and I just walked up the highway. I had no idea where I was going. And I hitched as far as I could go and ended up in the mountains. Somehow it just worked out that one of my clients was up there, and he's the one that offered me the job. But I was on autopilot. So it was almost like one of those, I was just following a path that I wasn't conscious of.
Do you feel like it was something that was led by a divine hand, so to speak?
I've thought about it a lot. Is this just a plan? Divine being, universal consciousness, collective consciousness? I don't know. But it was just put one foot in front of the other. And that was the most natural thing for me at that moment. Like everything else, a simple of keeping up appearances, I couldn't fathom it. I couldn't understand how that would even be expected.
Yeah.
But just one foot in front of the other, heading somewhere. I didn't even know where. So possibly a thing of collective consciousness being led to destiny. Absolutely. Yeah. What exactly? I don't know.
Yeah. Life is difficult to decipher sometimes, how things play out and happen the way that they do. Was this area a lot more rural than where you lived? Fewer people?
Yes.
Or was it just a new population?
Very quiet little town. And I spent a lot of my growing up years in more farming area and moved to the city as a preteen. So that could have also been the desire to try and get back to a little more space and a little more time.
Yeah. I'm so sorry for your loss. That would be really difficult.
Yeah. Thank you.
What are some of the lessons that you have learned from horses? Are there things that they've kind of taught you for not just interacting with them, but living?
Yeah. Patience. I think big one for me is patience. I am not by nature the most patient person, even though when people watch me, so trailer loading is still quite a big part of my business. People say, I don't know how you can be so patient. I used to tell people that patience was a disease for slow people.
Yeah.
But understanding how ineffective getting ahead of yourself is, that's really come handy. It's a lesson I have learned consciously, but one that I drop regularly in terms of human interactions. I'm still get caught in the idea of rushing around. That's why it's so important to keep horses around, so that they remind you of these lessons that you learn.
Yeah, it is really hard. I feel like for me, horses almost change the element of time, where it's like I can be in my house with a million things to do or be somewhere else, and then I go out to the barn or on a ride and I'm like, oh my gosh, that was way more time than I meant to spend there.
Yeah. Big one is patience. But there's another thing, and it comes from working with troubled horses. I said to you, initially I thought, okay, I just want to work with horses. I don't want to work with the people side. People are mean. People are, inconsiderate. People hurt each other for their own goals. The big thing that I figured out is when we talk about a troubled horse, there's no malice in that horse that someone calls aggressive, or that terrified horse is trying to defend itself that's put someone in hospital. There's an underlying reason for it. And for years, I had this incredible grace for the horses that had gone through that stuff. The penny dropped at some point that, hang on a minute, all of us that have these undesirable traits, when we get selfish, when we get jealous, greedy, there's an underlying cause behind that. And that consideration for the innocent kid underneath every single one of those people that I said I didn't want to work with, made it a lot easier for me to start working with people and being a little bit more forgiving.
Yeah, that is interesting. That lots of interesting things out of that. Just you can kind of see when you put that perspective on people why horses sometimes don't want to be around us. When you put those elements of humanity in there, selfishness, our own goals, our own agenda going in there. I mean, it makes sense why horses avoid us sometimes when we go in with that approach. And then also really interesting to just consider how, we can kind of bring horses really into our domestic world and injure them in a lot of ways, or cause them to shut down to just kind of be able to survive all our chaos. And that's almost the same thing that does happen to a lot of people where, we're children, where we're free and we kind of love ourselves. And then we get into this domestic world again or whatever, or all these expectations and things. And we kind of come out almost like the troubled horse sometimes.
Yeah. We come up with coping mechanisms, unhealthy coping mechanisms, and we hide our true selves, because so often in life, like a kid shows their true self and they get ridiculed, and but that doesn't fit into this social setting or this worldview, whatever worldview they're raised in, and it just makes that actual person shrink a little behind coping mechanism.
Do you feel like working with horses has kind of reopened you up to almost who you were as a child before you were kind of, those parts that I think all of us kind of have, those parts that are repressed or like, no, that's bad, don't be like that. Has working with horses changed that for you?
I definitely think it allows that space a lot more. But they say that people stay at the emotional age they are when their first major trauma happens. So it's normally childhood trauma. I felt like that big trauma. I was 26 when my daughter passed away. I was a young father. I felt that point was almost like a reset, and where I went back to wanting to be that free child that can say what you think and not be ridiculed for it.
Yeah. How do you go about helping the people that are kind of the ones that are, I guess, in a way, reflecting their struggles onto the horse?
So someone asked me recently, like, what is the focus of your work? There's a lot of horsemanship programs. What is the focus of your work? And I have been saying, and I still do believe, that connection and relaxation is the focus of my horsemanship work. But I do think that I have shifted that overall priority to helping people be safe with horses. The overwhelming number of people that love horses, but they're terrified to be around them. They're terrified to be on their backs. People come to me they say, I've got confidence issues. And really what it comes down to is this industry has bullied them into just get on and ride. Hospital or back on the horse. You got bucked off, get straight back on. These are all things cause a form of PTSD. So I work with a lot of people that are nervous of either their horse. Very often it's their particular horse, where they've had a troubled horse and they've had difficult experiences or traumatic experiences with their horse. And they're not willing to give up on their horse, which is the industry standard. Well, that horse has hurt you. Get rid of one. Get rid of it and get an easy horse. People that follow through with their horses, and it's a journey that they take together. And I think I've become really passionate about that relationship as opposed to just the horse. It's the relationship between the person that loves the horse and the troubled horse.
What are some changes that you've been able to see in people by, it sounds like, changing the approach that they're taking from, do XYZ, keep it going, make your horse do this, versus, make a relationship, have safe interactions, build a partnership?
I think people get incredibly empowered. The simple realization that they're in charge of their timeline, their horse's timeline, and what is expected of them. There's nothing that says within 3 months you need to be cantering around. Whereas that's been a thing. It's like, why aren't you cantering your horse?
Yeah.
Or why, like even earlier than that, why aren't you riding your horse? If people aren't ready to ride, there's nothing wrong with getting the horse a little further, building that communication on the ground, and then transferring it once you feel confident. And if you never feel confident, that's okay too. That empowering people of that actual realization that, because they will agree with you when you say it to them, but it's not understood on an experiential level. So it takes a while for them to figure out, hey, hang on a minute, I'm not going to get on my horse, or I'm not going to canter, or I'm not going to go on a trail ride until I'm 100% ready. That normally unlocks them to be a little bit more courageous, because they almost, all the fear of it, all the expectation creates this fear of the thing at the end that when they get on there's no fear of that. They expect, they're fearing the thing that's coming in the future.
Yeah.
And that does wonders for people's confidence.
I think that's also part of what troubles us in society overall, is that we feel like there's these certain expectations that we're meant to meet to be considered successful or good or whatever our goals might be, that we create this inner turmoil when we don't meet them. And the same thing, it seems like, with horses, like we're so scared of failing in a way that we cause that failure inadvertently.
Yeah, we're not where everyone else is. And I think that's across the board in society. Like, we all look around and say, well, everyone else seems to have it together. All it really comes down to is everyone else is doing a better job of pretending than we are. We're all going through the same stuff in our head. And maybe the guys that pretend the best are the shut down ones that we have traditionally held up as our examples, but probably not the healthiest people. Invulnerable, shut off, closed off from the world around us.
And something that I think is so good to talk about, I really love how you kind of talked about having to build that confidence yourself, because, I think now people could go look and see all this great work that you're doing with horses, but that it was a process. It wasn't overnight, even though it sounds like you really have a natural talent and inclination to understand the horse. What are some of the things that built your confidence? Was it just seeing the results, or was there a mental shift as well?
For me, confidence always comes from knowledge. That uncertainty of not knowing for sure is difficult for me. And I know there's power in not knowing for sure. But in terms of being around a horse, I have this thing that I do when I get on a young horse for the first time, or a troubled horse for the first time, that is probably terrible advice for most people. I would not encourage everyone to do this. But because I am so anchored by knowledge, when I get on, I run through potential things that could go wrong. What's the worst thing that could happen? And if that worst thing happened, what do I do about it? Is it within my control? If it's not within my control, there's nothing I can do about it. I would play back. Can I actually get down, forget getting on, and make that something more certain? That being said, though, that sounds very control freak. As someone that actually doesn't believe in the idea of control other than control of your own actions. So that running through is, what are the things that I can do in each of those situations? That's not about controlling.
Where do you have control?
If we're honest with ourselves, I tell this to people in clinics that are coming, and they've coming for confidence issues. And a lot of the time, people that are coming for confidence issues say the language is, I just need to be able to control my horse more. That's when I normally have to break the news to them, is that controlling your horse is a lie in the industry. If you think you can control a 600 kg, 700 kg animal Especially if you think you can control it with pain, you've got some news coming.
So what kind of shift do they have to take then when they're not confident? Think control's the answer to confidence. What is the real answer
This
to
is the
gain
one
that
area,
confidence?
that area there is one that I don't think we talk about the benefits of groundwork for people enough. If you can have communication with a horse on the ground and you can see that horse has got understanding, and so basically you know how to communicate everything you want from the horse. You know how to identify signs of stress, because we know that stressed animals are the ones that get us hurt. You know what to do about that stress. You know that you can help that horse self-regulate, so technically co-regulate. Those are things that change the game for people, because it's no longer about control, it's about knowing what they can do when it goes wrong, and knowing what they can do to prevent it going wrong. It doesn't matter how traumatized people are. Repetitive situations where they know how to read it and know what to do about it builds a lot of confidence.
And are there some specific things that you do to kind of see that, and then also to help with relaxation?
Yeah, and things that are pretty much industry standard in horsemanship, things like the hindquarter disengagement. We're now seeing a lot of support for the reasoning behind why things like a hindquarter disengagement work. But beyond that, introducing things in a way that a horse understands. Thinking about things like a horse's neurochemistry, a horse that is hypervigilant, spooky horse that people talk about, that is an animal that's lived on anxiety so long that its body produces more anxiety than more adrenaline than dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin. So even in a situation where that horse is in a safe space, people talk about a horse that seems to be looking for things to spook at. It's not consciously looking for things to spook at, but its chemistry says, hey, there's something weird here. And it doesn't take much to find something to be scared of in that human world.
Yeah.
So I deal with a lot of balancing neurochemistry. I mean, the most obvious one there is the most common reason I see for neurochemical imbalance is horses being kept in isolation. If a horse does not mutual groom with another horse, their neurochemistry starts shifting, because when they mutual groom, the mechanical motion of that muzzle rubbing against their pair bond releases dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin. The minute you start keeping them away from that, their neurochemistry will start shifting. I talk about it as being horses' natural anti-anxiety medication comes from other horses. And it's not just from being able to see other horses. They've got to be able to mutual groom. Not to say that every single horse that's neurochemically imbalanced. I've recently got a big Warlander, and he was living in the most perfect horse situation you could find. Massive herd out in the mountains, and he's still neurochemically imbalanced. And it took probably a month. I was working with him out at his owner's place, and she said to me, hang on a minute, I've actually never seen him groom another horse. He wasn't pair bonded. Even in what we would think would be a natural setting, that does happen. And it's been an eye-opener for me, and I've started to see it with other horses, and even do things like teaching horses how to horse. We actually encourage them to mutual groom, and you see the change in them. So there are manual manipulations. Massaging a forelock triggers dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin because of the mother-foal bond. When foals drink from their mom, their forelock rubs on their forehead rubs on her belly, and in the first couple of days it releases dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin.
Yeah.
So those are manipulations you can do to help a horse through. But the ideal is you keep them in a herd environment.
Do you think with that one horse who was not mutual grooming, was that a result of something that had happened to him, do you think? Or something he didn't get that he needed early on?
Yeah, if something ever happened to me and my partner, I would want my horses to be there because it's the best place in the world for horses.
It's so good.
And their handling and their knowledge is out of this world. But there were little things. He was born, and 2 days later, another horse lost its mother, and they brought in the foal, and the mother was nursing both. Who knows? Maybe that was the start of it. Maybe he just wasn't getting as much dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin then, and it transferred through his whole life. So it's really tricky to go back on those wild situations where you don't watch the dynamic. But I've seen in situations where you got a well-balanced herd, and then one horse gets sold or whatever, and it disrupts the pair bond. And it might not even be the pair bond that was left behind, but the whole herd goes through an adjustment, and they go for a couple of years without mutual grooming. When they get back into a situation where they possibly could, they're nervous of it. Getting close with another horse where they've been chased off or whatever now becomes a dangerous thing.
Is that imbalance something that you just observe through behavior?
Yeah. So I always, sometimes we can get too hooked onto what caused it. And I think I'm a little bit of a Sherlock Holmes addict and I try and figure things out. But, when it comes down to it, there are many situations where you can't figure out the cause, but you see the symptoms of a hypervigilant horse. Horses are not by nature hypervigilant. I think it's one of the biggest lies in the equine industry that horses are just spooky and unpredictable. If they were spooky and unpredictable, they would not survive as a species. They've got to have their heads down in long grass all day. When you observe horses in a natural setting, they're not jumping around every time something moves. They're actually pretty relaxed. If, let's say, once every 24 hours, out of every 24 hours, a horse has a spook for 10 to 15 minutes, if that classes them as spooky, then I'm a very foul-mouthed, bad-tempered person in traffic. Because out of every 24 hours that I'm driving, there's going to be a fair amount of them that I'm swearing and getting angry. But I don't believe horses are spooky and unpredictable. I feel that we're unaware. That's why we think they're unpredictable. And they're unprepared for what we ask of them.
Yeah. And I thought it was really interesting, too, a couple things you said when you talked about the wild horse and her kind of checking out the rope. Like she was just checking it out on her own.
Yes.
I think it's really interesting because we take all these things into their world and we think like, oh, it's just a rope. You should be fine. Like it's not going to hurt you. But it's such a new, novel thing for them. And then, also with the isolation, I think a lot of times we think horses need what we need, when the reality is they have different needs from us in a lot of circumstances. So we might need them to be warm and safe in a stall by themselves, knowing they're not going to get kicked, but that's not necessarily helping their needs.
Yeah, it's like one of the major things you hear from people, like when people start talking about maybe we should look at changing welfare issues in the sporting world, the equestrian sporting world. And people say, but these equestrian athletes live like kings. I don't necessarily think it's like equestrian kings, from their point of view. I don't think it is the ideal. But if you were to work at it, I joke with people and say, can you imagine if you work at it to scale and you were kept in a room the size proportionate of what your horses, so a 600 kg animal in a 5x5. So the idea that these top athletes are living like kings, it doesn't really line up. Kings get to say where they go, when they go, and what they do. And these animals are told when they have to be where and what they get to do. And it's in settings that don't meet their species appropriate needs.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me too, because I almost feel like we do that with humans also. Like we think all these comforts are going to make our life better, or getting more things, taking better care of ourselves. And sometimes, at least for me, it's like I need space and like some time in nature and, not all these material things that we think provide a higher quality of life.
Yeah, it's just things to kind of distract us from the fact that we're probably not living in a way that meets our species' appropriate needs.
To kind of wrap up, what is some advice that you would give to someone, and I'm guessing a lot of times these are related, someone who is either struggling in their own life or struggling with their horses? What is something they can maybe do to get on a better path?
Yeah, in terms of the partnership of the human and the horse, identify what your priority is. Sometimes people get a little bit judgy and telling people what their priorities should be. Yeah, for me, my priority is connection and having a safe, happy horse. Whatever I get to do with it is fantastic. Different people have different priorities. Identify your priority and then find someone that reflects your philosophies to help you reach your priority. And
that's super important.
I think in the world in general, not just the horse world, we have never had a time where so much information is available to us. But in terms of the equestrian thing, not all information applies to us. We don't need to learn everything and confuse the living daylights and our horse. And we can learn the things that are appropriate to what we need. If you have goals of being a world champion reiner, then absolutely you need education from someone that can get you there. I would add, though, that in those settings, don't forget the safety and happy horse part, because it makes a big difference to have a safe, happy horse. When I started competing, I think I was kind of in the prove a point mentality when I'm doing a more empathetic approach. Say, hang on, you can actually still win being empathetic and considering your horse. And that's fine. Like, I've kind of got to a point where you figure out that you can't prove a point to everybody. They'll find some reason to say, oh, but not in show jumping or not in this, or they'll always find some reason. People are just on different paths. But like I said earlier, I was beating riders far better because I had a safe, happy horse. So even if your goals are those highly competitive goals, make sure you get the relaxation and happiness first.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, a lot of times is a quicker path to where you want to go if you can kind of get the foundational things, which is the horse feeling safe, not being on high alert, stressed out, worry mode the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah, everyone thinks, well, one of the most common objections I hear from people when I'm trying to set out a plan for them, but I don't have the time for that. The reality is you can take the shortcuts and all the vet bills and hospital bills that come with those shortcuts, but you're still going to have to go back and fix it. But there's a thing that shortcuts are never safe, or they're never easy. If the distance from one place to the next was not the shortest way, if it was easy and it wasn't dangerous, it would be the way. It wouldn't just be a shortcut.
Yeah.
So you've got to actually go through that. At some point you have to go back and fix it, and then you've got the consequences, which are normally injuries and a whole bunch of unhealthy coping mechanisms.
And how have horses changed your life or influenced your life?
I think I'm a lot more in the moment, not hunting a point in the future, not living in the past. You really have to be in the moment with horses. And when you're working with horses as a profession, it almost becomes a training, to the point that I would say I normally have to be really conscious about thinking, well, I need to do some forward planning now, which is not actually a strong point for me. So it's a good thing and a bad thing, but overall, it's good for your mental health to be in the moment.
Yeah. What are some ways that people can take advantage of what you do, learn more about you? Are there ways that those of us who are not in South Africa can still benefit from all your knowledge and all the things you've learned?
Yeah. If people want to, you can find me on social media. My personal profile, which is Gareth Mare on Facebook. My business page, Heartfelt Horsemanship, is on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. So I do try to put as much free material up on YouTube for the stuff that I think should be stock standards in terms of considering.
Yeah.
I do have a Patreon account, but my Patreon account is actually geared for people that have been through a clinic. Patreon's a little bit tricky to lay out a clear plan, but I'll be launching a website in the next probably 2 weeks, which will have online courses available.
Cool. Yeah, that's very exciting. Well, I just want to thank you for being here. I love the work that you do and just the perspective that you bring to horses, just that you really can have that connection with them. And I know that that's something I found once I was able to kind of let go of all those pressures that were around me that weren't really things I wanted to do anyway. So I love that you're sharing that message, just that there is this beautiful way that you can work with horses and, accomplish a lot of the goals and dreams that you have. I love that your voice is out there kind of countering some of the other voices, and that you're able to share that with others. Thanks so much for being here. And I loved the story with your little black wild or feral horse. Such a neat story.
If anyone wants to read that, it will be it's actually on my personal profile on Facebook. Stories of
cool. So neat. I'm definitely going to go read them. So thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us and learning about horses that heal and the humans who help them. We hope you'll continue with us on this journey. We'd love for you to subscribe on your favorite platform and follow The Touch of a Mustang on any of the major social media outlets. Please share with your friends, anyone who loves horses, or anyone who might be struggling and could benefit from this message. If you have felt the healing power of horses or help them in their divinely appointed mission, please reach out. We want to hear your story. As we say goodbye, always remember that the horse is always there to help you heal.